Wishing you a holy Easter and pristine palm crosses, everybody. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this last week of No Plastics for Lent 2025. Here with Ellie Derringer, I'm Baron Linky. We're here just to do a quick recap of things that we've learned, the things that our speakers have brought to us, ways that that's enriched Lent for all of us, I hope, and turned us a bit more towards our neighbor and towards creation. And then looking ahead to Holy Week, which is upon us. It's crazy how fast this goes. It's both one of those things where you're looking back at Ash Wednesday as like a different planet and also feeling like, and it's already done and we're moving on and life is crazy. I don't know if that resonates with you, Ellie, but I'm really feeling the first Lent season in first call for sure.
I think it's safe to say we're probably feeling it very differently. I feel like the time has gone by quickly, and I don't have nearly as much responsibility for facilitating all of the goings on of Lent. So I can only imagine.
We both put on some miles during this season. You getting to go to the UN, and um, I just got back from Princeton. I'm about to head up to Flathead Lutheran Bible Camp to teach about confirmation. We also have life happening around us, which I think is
That'll.
it's a good illustration, or at least a reminder to me, that these seasons of the church that are trying to help give us some structure to the way that we engage with God and with community that kind of varies and rotates throughout the year. All of that happens in a world that is not structured in the same patterns. Like we have to make active choices to do that in a way that is spiritually fulfilling or feels faithful or restful. And I'm sure that folks who've been coming along on this journey can relate to feeling like, I don't know, on a report card how good I did at that this year. Uh, I
Good
am
thing the
grateful.
report cards is what it's all about, you know?
Right. All I want ever in life is a grade of how I'm doing in pretty much every dimension. If I could give a survey to my friends after we hang out of like, how would you rate this interaction? How can I do better next time? Um, there's just parts of my neuroses I would really, really like that. But how are you feeling as we're getting ready for Holy Week, which is going to be, uh, I think it's busy, but I think that's deliberate, a time where we are invited to really dwell in that story of the last week that isn't necessarily supposed to be just another thing to add onto the calendar or a bunch more commitments to show up for socially, but the pace of it, I think, is meant to be kind of just speed bumps as we're leading up to it. Like Lent is this season of set apart spirituality, of real intention, of reflection, and then we end it with Holy Week. It's like if you didn't get it over the last 30 odd days, we're gonna really ask you to slow down now. How are you feeling as you're approaching that? Is that what's that looking like for you in your corner of the world?
Yeah, I think going back to kind of what you said before about this like season of the church not necessarily aligning with the season of life that we might be in, I think I actually am seeing a lot of parallels going
Mm,
into Holy Week, specifically thinking about like the environment around me
mm,
and the ways that the seasons are changing. Um, these past few days, like there have been more sunny days. I've been seeing a lot more like there's a lot of beautiful flowering trees around me, lots of cherry blossoms, so many
mm.
magnolia trees, which is gorgeous. I also was complaining to you about my seasonal allergies, kicking up with that. Yeah, and if you're living in a place with a lot of pollen right now, you might be not super excited about that change. Um, but I think that has going into Holy Week and thinking about
Mm,
like Easter and what is important about this idea of like rebirth, renewal, and um, this change towards flourishing. I think. I'm seeing that reflected in the environment around me. And so it's
Mm,
making me kind of the outward to inward change is starting to happen. Um, Plus my brain loves the sunshine. So like I feel like I'm coming more alive, um, which is great. And
mhm,
I think kind of, yeah, especially I've been reflecting on some of Kia's comments about like, gosh, doing the dishes without listening to music or podcasts. And I walked to work the other day without listening to music. And I've been loving focusing on walking to work in this kind of like Lenten time. But I was paying way more attention to even like the structures around me, the homes. There's a lot of like
mm,
historic homes where I'm living right now that have really unique um, architecture, I guess, and just like design and seeing all the little touches of like what each family or each like the folks living in these houses have brought to these homes. And I think all of that coming together, I've just been thinking a lot about old and new and touches that are like brought by um, like people living in a place and the cultivation of the trees and the plants that I'm seeing that are flowering, who's taking care of them or who isn't like taking care of them and just letting them do their thing. And um, I think all of those things are kind of swirling in my mind now that I've opened up a little more space without the podcasts or audiobooks and music, which feels uncomfortable, but also really nice. I think all of that is just kind of this like beautiful bubbling cauldron of like we're
mm,
going into Holy Week, and Easter is coming. What does resurrection mean? What does it? What does new life kind of mean in a metaphorical sense for us, especially in
mhm.
the context where we live and in our communities? Um, what does the changing of the church season have to do with the changing of the season around us? It's just all of that is swirling around for me.
Oof. It's good
Yeah.
stuff though. I appreciate you really bringing out like the change of the season, the experience of spring, new flowers, plants, and allergies. But the that evidence of like no life continues in its season. And when I said the world doesn't match up with that, the reminder like no, the earth kind of does. And if humans don't, then that's more of a thing like that's a you problem. That's an us problem. Uh, the world's got to figure it out as a globe, as an ecosystem, as life patterns, and we just live kind of resistant to that and try to put our own schedule on that in so many ways. So thank you for that. I needed that that reminder.
Well, and I have a question
Yeah.
to just kind of pick your brain, your scholarly, theological, historical knowledge. It is my, at least maybe rudimentary, maybe superficial understanding that
Mhm.
some of like the major events in the Christian church, like Easter and Christmas, also their calendar placement has to do with some more like naturalistic pagan
Mhm.
like festivals. I'm wondering if you could just like speak to that of thinking of the interplay of like how humans have over time who live in a societal context,
Right.
integrated what makes sense for the way they live their day-to-day life with what's popular at the time. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And you're right. There are a lot of places where our periodic or like annual festivals line up with patterns in the earth, and that does involve some background of just like ancient timekeeping was always very linked to seasons. So that was a very easy way to orient your religious festivals. I mean, Jewish folks, Christian folks, Muslim folks, all in this season are really intentional about their faith leading up to Passover. For Jewish folks, we're just about done with Ramadan, or may have just finished. I'm working with the local Muslim community on an Eid celebration, and we keep moving the date around, so I'm trying to remember exactly when it is. But Ramadan has overlapped very heavily with Lent. Um, and that all lines up closely with the equinox, with the transition of seasons moving into that time of new life. And I think that there is a real human desire to build ritual around those patterns that we see moving around us in the world, and that's reflected in our like liturgical calendars, whichever faith happens to do it. With Christmas, that lines up very closely with the winter solstice and the return of light. That season right after Christmas is called Epiphany, which is like the season of light, and it is oriented around the fact that the days are literally starting to get longer, that there is literally more light in the world, um, in the northern hemisphere at the very least. That looks
Yeah.
different in the southern hemisphere, but those things being linked together isn't an accident. Like there was a lot of attention that went into that. Uh, Most historians think that Jesus was probably born like May-ish by our calendar, but that celebration of like the light of God coming into the world lined up so easily with existing celebrations around the winter solstice that it became this really natural place to say this is when we'll celebrate it,
Mm.
and give honor to that because it lines up with our like biological experience of light coming back. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing, that there's just this human desire to just treat the patterns of the world as being as sacred as they are.
Mm.
I think that there there's one way of thinking about it as like we take these secular or mundane, uh, profane, I guess is like the medieval theology way of describing it, like things that aren't holy, and
Mm.
give them sacred significance. And I think that one of the really beautiful things uh, about the life of faith is that it kind of turns that on its head and says like it's all holy. The question is what kind of attention are you paying to it? And God's invitation into that holiness is it's a lot. It's hard to stay engaged with. And so these seasons like Lent where we are setting aside time to really dedicate ourselves to reflecting on that, to these practices that help us experience that in the way that we structure our schedules, our diets, our relationships with other people, our relationships with God. I think it's important to be able to have like those intensives almost,
Yeah.
like that those times of major focus, because it can be so easy outside of those times to fall back into that space of like things are sometimes holy, or things are
Mm.
uh, like waiting for us to bless them, or something like that, instead of the truth, which is the holiness is there for us to experience. That when God made it and said it's good, in some ways that's kind of a challenge of all right, so go get it, go enjoy,
Yeah.
um, and treat that with the honor and the holiness that it deserves, which I think should be fun. I think that's a really underrated part of holiness, is that like enjoyment and pleasure and the delight that God has in the spring, in the return of sun and sprouting flowers and all of that is good. It should be it should be nice. There's no accident that our brains, with all that extra sunlight, start going like I'm alive again. And that experience of like annually coming out of winter and being like, oh, the world is good and I'm in it and I'm alive and thank God is I think really good for us.
I think part of why the question came up for me is just thinking about like we're having this conversation about humans are a part of our environments.
Mhm.
Sometimes we try to control too much or make decisions that overtake, other elements of the environments we're around. But I think just thinking about how we make decisions, even back into time, how we make decisions about what's important to us, where we want to dedicate our time and our resources. I think it's just fascinating to me to look at like why does Easter fall when it falls every
Mm,
year? What does it have to do with like the lunar cycles and all this stuff? And um, and thinking about there is no one set date, or it's not always been the exact same time when these annual traditions happen.
mhm,
Um, for some of them, it is a specific date, but also it's like, was that true centuries ago? When were those things changed? When did it make sense to celebrate different things? I think it's asking those questions again, kind of calling upon Kia's invitation to just ask questions about things,
mhm,
open up those conversations, queer it up a little bit,
mhm,
thinking about it that way. But also just, even going back to that kind of imagery of the compost and the soil
mm,
and and that conversation about fasting and what energy, what life is there that we can't see, that is feeding and nourishing things to come that we can try to anticipate, but nothing is going to bloom in the exact same way. I think all of the conversations that we've had have been doing exactly what you said about
mm,
taking the mundane and those little day-to-day things that maybe don't seem holy or
mhm.
sacred and pointing our attention to it, just kind of zooming in, zooming out, putting on different lenses, and seeing how we are changed when we approach them differently.
Absolutely. I think that's right on. These like traditional Lenten practices have fancy names like fasting or almsgiving, but they just describe paying more attention to the thing that you're already doing. Of like the traditional way of fasting of like paying attention to how you eat and trying to reflect on that and be diligent about it. You're already eating. You're already making choices every day about what you eat. Fasting invites you to be more deliberate in that choice. You're already giving your resources to people around you who need it. The practice of almsgiving, and like that just already happens. The practice of almsgiving gives you the chance to be more deliberate about the reflection on that and how and why you're doing that and to whom and what. Um, I think especially in the social media age, you're giving your attention to something. That's all. That's really true. And we're living in a world that wants our attention so badly for so many things, and deciding what to give our attention to, paying attention to our attention. I think that prayer is a really good practice for that. Uh, all those things are things that we're already doing, and this is a season that's asking why or how. What is the decision that you're making, and how are you doing it? And I'm so grateful for the chance to reflect on that, especially during a year like this where the news is fast and furious, and there's really important things that require quick response. Um, and it can get very easy to be spending so much of our attention on that without spending any of our action and feeling like that's the
Yeah.
same thing. Like, because I'm as informed as I've ever been about anything in my entire life, that means that I am proactively making the world a better place. And it's worth asking whether or not that's true. Like,
Yeah.
am I, is the way that I'm giving my attention to the news of what's happening to my neighbors in the world actually leading me to act on their behalf, or to cocoon myself more and more into a place like, well, things just keep happening and all I hope is that they don't happen to me. And
Mhm.
that can be really tempting. And so giving some structure and community, uh, I, I like that Lent is this time where churches often will have like extra times to be together, times to share a meal, to
Yeah.
pray or do education, to be deliberate about that and do that with other people automatically pushes against that urge to be like, all right, I'm closing myself off. I am wrapping myself in a cocoon of like constant vigilance but no engagement with
Mhm.
with the world around me. And I've just been so grateful for the speakers that we've had and the ways that they've been teaching us and this community about different ways of directing that attention and structuring that time or this season to take that seriously because
Yeah.
it's needed. Like our attention, our gifts, our acts of service, our prayers, the choices that we make about what to consume and how, like all of that's really, 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 really relevant right now in ways that I wish it wasn't. But
Yeah, and I think just seeing some through lines and some connections with what is on the individual level, what's on the collective level, how can we oscillate between the two? At what
mm,
point is individual prayer in the sense of like you in communication with the divine or spending time with yourself or like having journaling, etc. versus when does communal prayer, what does that look like? Does
mm,
that mean like being in a group of people talking about what's going on in the world and getting fired up with a righteous anger about it and then deciding to do something or protesting? Like I think all of these practices are something that you can do kind of on your own and
mm,
also in community. And I think having that flexibility to engage in it on multiple levels is great because just like in winter and in this season of information gathering,
mm,
being aware of things can be really important, but that's preparing and providing nutrients for the flourishing, the
right.
springtime when new things emerge, action is taken. I think
Mm,
we can also kind of take that seasonal lens and look at our own relationship to advocacy and engagement and you know caring for our neighbors. We can kind of apply that lens
mm.
if your brain works like mine does and you hear a metaphor and you're like, oh, that makes sense for me.
So, what are you going to be taking with you from what we've learned from our contributors this season? Like, what does next Lent look like with the stuff that you've learned through this season?
Most generally, I think I just have a more expansive um, understanding or kind of approach to what these practices could look like.
Mm,
Um, And so, who's to say what next Lent will look like exactly, but I know that it will be a more rich and complex experience for me because my mind has already been opened to different ways of thinking about this time, and a more creative way of thinking about specific actions to be taken or practices to kind of take on. Um, I think also just feeling myself being challenged by like, okay, maybe I do need to just dedicate more time to prayer, or maybe I need to be more
mm,
diligent and structured about what mutual aid could look like um, outside of the season, but also next Lenten season. I think drawing that kind of inspiration from what I've learned and what I've seen through the example of our contributors and our conversations that have happened, it's just like, oh, that's really cool. I can both be impressed and inspired to follow in those footsteps, but also think more creatively and expansively
yeah.
for next Lent and the time in between.
Hmm.
What about you?
I think the main thing that I'm taking away from this is that sense of expansion and how many different things can be a part of this. To take that season metaphor, like spring is neither summer nor winter, and it is often like day to day feels a lot like one or the other, and then the next day comes and you never mind, that's not what we were experiencing. Um, and the fact that we got to do this with people, that there are so many faithful and smart and reflective and passionate people out there that we get to do this in community with. Um, that's just been a real comfort to me through this, and more than any of the like specific brilliant things that people said, and those will stick with me too. But more than just that, the ideas, the better understanding of community, of what it means to be a part of a body of Christ that's doing this together, um, in our own in our own specific ways, but that are still integrated into the whole, has been, yeah, it's been a comfort during a time where I've really needed it. So really just gratitude. And gratitude for everyone who has been following along, who's been taking this seriously, who's been asking big questions of themselves and each other and of God during this season, and trusting us to get to do that together. We're so grateful that you've chosen to let us be a part of this journey through these 40 days leading up to really good news at a time in the world where good news is at a premium. So thank you all for joining on with us, and prayers for all of you in your holy weeks as you prepare to finally sing those hallelujahs and celebrate that the bad stuff in this world doesn't win. And that doesn't mean it's not powerful. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be opposed. It doesn't mean that God isn't at work actively opposing it through us, and that we need to be ready to step up when God asks us to. But the good news is that the that love wins at the end of this.
And
All
I
right.
wish you all, if you, like me, like to make the little crosses out of the palms from Palm Sunday, I hope they turn out beautifully. That was always my biggest challenge as a child. So wishing you great palm crosses on Palm
Wishing you
Sunday.
a holy Easter and pristine palm crosses, everybody. Thank you so much. I've been Baird Linky. This has been Ellie Derringer. Happy Easter.